Shuga and Chagum did lessons with Tonda the Star Reader, while Sun and Hyoku watched the doors. Did Jin tell you who Chagum's crush is? Sun whispered. Hyoku shook his head. He must know, though. I've asked everyone else, and they don't know, but Jin's a rotten liar. Sun nodded sagely. Well, if Jin won't tell us who she is, we might try the herbalist. Or perhaps we might try tailing Jin, Sun asked. As if he actually knows anything, sniffed Hyoku. Well, the only way to find out is to follow him, said Sun. I say we do it tonight. Hyoku rolled his eyes. Fine, but it's a waste of time. While this conversation was happening, Chagum and Tonda were alone in a gazebo in the center of a large koi pond, where no one could eavesdrop on their conversation, not even Shuga, who Chagum knew was dying to listen in. Chagum was so happy that he couldn't keep the smile off of his face. He had never dreamed that he would have Tonda here with him in the palace. Now, said Tonda, how do you intend to convey your feelings to this Mitsuha girl? I can't, Chagum said, his face falling. Of course you can, said Tonda, setting a reassuring hand on his arm. And you have to, otherwise you'll be sad like this forever. And you know, there are a couple of other girls on the way here now. Chagum looked up sharply. What? Did Shuga? Jin told me that the hunters tried to guess who you were pining after, and they've summoned Princess Saruna of Songal here, with Nimka hiding in her entourage. They are certain that your love is one of them. Chagum made a face. Of course, I can understand why they would guess them, and no one would ever guess that the girl I love is the betrothed of your brother, Chagum, Tonda finished, and a Yugaraku at that. Don't worry, said Tonda, we'll figure out a way. But how? Chagum asked. I haven't been able to meet her openly. I don't know if I should confess my feelings to my mother and try to formalize it, or we would need someone with political connections to do that. It would be cruel to put that on her alone. What about telling Shuga? But if Shuga knows who she is, Gakkai will know too, and it will be a cascading snowball of disaster, Chagum said. Cascading snowball of disaster, which turns into an avalanche of disaster. Then we'll just have to keep her identity and our plan a secret from Shuga. Chagum looked disappointed. I hate to keep things from him, but how can we do this without telling him? We need help from someone within the palace. I'm sure that you could get some of the hunters to help. Do you think they'll defy Shuga? Tonda laughed. I know that Jin will, and I bet there are others who don't care about ruffling Shuga's feathers. We shouldn't have any trouble. Chagum nodded. I'll arrange a meeting, but we can't have a second meeting today. People might get suspicious. Tomorrow. Tonda nodded. Tomorrow. The next day, when it was time for lessons, once again Tonda was there, dressed in his Star Reader robes. He made a very convincing Star Reader. Chagum hoped that they might be able to keep this ruse up well enough that they could do it again sometime. This time, however, Shuga was not present, nor Gakkai. Instead, it was three of the hunters, Jin, Hyoku, and a very frowny-faced Mon. Mon stood watch in the garden, while Chagum spoke to the other three in the island gazebo. The girl I love, said Chagum with a deep breath, isn't Princess Saruna. Called it, whispered Hyoku, grinning and elbowing Jin. Or Nimka, said Chagum, and Hyoku's grin vanished. It's, Mitsuha Yugaraku. Your brother's fiancé? Said Hyoku, startled. That's weird. Jin's reaction, however, was far more extreme. Clearly he forgot that he figured this out, so it's a surprise all over again. He looked appalled and disgusted, as if Chagum had just announced the girl he loved was Master Torogai. His tone was dangerously quiet as he said, Your Highness, your love is a Yugaraku? With all due respect, Prince Chagum, you must be insane. The Yugarakus are snakes, demons, vultures, every last one. Not Mitsuha, said Chagum, frowning. She's still just a kid, said Hyoku. She hasn't had time to turn evil. I don't care, said Jin icily. A Yugaraku is a Yugaraku. Your Highness, I can't condone this. I have to tell Shuga. Maybe he can talk some sense into you. And so, Shuga was brought in on the secret of Crown Prince Chagum's love. The girl herself was present for the meeting. Was she now? Along with Chagum, who stood in front of her like he was trying to shield her from danger. Shuga's eyes moved from Chagum to Mitsuha Yugaraku. Well, it's a surprise, but it's not as bad as I was expecting. What? Chagum and Jin asked at the same time. You're both of the appropriate social class, and you're not closely related, Shuga said. I'll bring the matter to the holy sage. He might approve the match. Chagum squeezed Mitsuha's hand, but he didn't dare look at her. I'm opposed, Jin said. Because she's a Yuguraku, Hyoku filled in. Mitsuha flinched. You should know better than anyone that you can't choose the family you're born into, Jin, Chagum said. Oh, snap. Princess Mishuna's technically a Yuguraku too, isn't she? Added Hyoku, unsolicited. You don't have a problem with her. Jin glared at him, as if Suyo were a traitor, but he didn't have a response to that. His Highness is right, Hyoku pressed. Lady Mitsuha's lineage doesn't define her identity. Chagum and Tonda both nodded. Jin's shoulders fell. He was still scowling, but the rage seemed to have dissipated. I apologize, Your Highness. Of course, I will do whatever you require. No less than I have come to expect from you, Jin, said Chagum, smiling. Now, let's go over the plot again. The next day, flanked by Jin and Hyoku, his hunter bodyguards of the day, Chagum went to visit the grave of his brother. Shuga and Tonda were with them in their formal Star Reader cloaks. As they neared the grotto where the imperial family had been buried since the days of Torgal, Tonda suddenly bent and pointed to a small yellow flower. Master Shuga, this is Iki flower. Why, this is an incredibly rare herb. Shuga looked excited and confused. But that just looks like sunleaf. I've seen it hundreds of times. Oh, no, Tonda insisted. See how the leaves curl inwards, and that slightly lighter coloring and... The sounds of his monologue faded off as Chagum continued to walk to the cemetery. As he went forward into the grotto and knelt by Sagum's grave, the hunters took up positions at the entrance to the grotto. Tonda would keep Shuga delayed as long as possible, and the hunters would keep him out of the graveyard. Chagum had told them to say he wanted his privacy. The prince smiled to himself. For at least a little while he would have total privacy. Just him, his beloved, and the spirits. He planned to savor it. A day before the summer festival, Jin and Mon helped Chagum to escape to find his beloved. The Naig spirits would be there too. In fact, they were already there, only waiting the perfect time to show themselves to him. The moon was bright in the night sky, and some gray-bluish clouds dotted it. He found a silhouette near the forest, with some luminous forms that only Chagum could see. He smiled. Mitsuha Yuguraku smiled back and hurried over. This was the girl that Chagum loved, in case you hadn't gotten that already. She had been betrothed to Sagum when she was only 6, along with a much older girl from Umutoran House, but before Sagum could marry either girl, he had died. Both girls were suddenly cast adrift, with no clear position in the nobility, expected to act like widows despite having never been married. Mitsuha was the same age as Chagum. As crown prince, he knew his future brides were being decided, with no input from him, of course, and he knew there was a very small possibility that Sagum's ex-fiancés would become his own. Secretly, he hoped that Mitsuha, at least, would be selected to be one of his queens, even though he knew her younger cousin was far more likely. She was sweet and uncertain, bubbly and earnest, quite unlike most noble ladies. She was also very clever, and instinctively knew how people wanted her to behave, which meant that, in public settings, she behaved exactly as demure and well-mannered as expected. But, much like Chagum's sister Mishuna, she was curious and talkative, and she didn't like following the rules. In fact, maybe that was what most attracted him. He hated rules, and he loved the fact that she did too. She bowed quickly to Sagum's headstone, then turned to Chagum, smiling, and boldly took his hands in hers. I never thought that we would meet like this, even without the servants to watch and listen. Oh, Chagum, wouldn't it be delightful if we just ran away together? We could run to the stables and steal horses, or throw ourselves into the river and be carried downstream. We'd disguise ourselves as commoners and go be pirates. Wouldn't that be delightfully exciting? Just you and me and the stars and the ocean waves. They talked for what felt like an eternity, but eventually a low whistle signaled that Shuga was coming. Quickly, Chagum bid Mitsuha farewell and hurried to meet Shuga before Shuga could see her. Because, you see, he somehow doesn't know now that he's met her before. Your Highness, where have you been? Shuga said, frowning. I was paying my respects to my brother, but I've finished. We can return to the second palace now. Chagum's secret was out, and more or less accepted. Maybe he would be able to meet Mitsuha without the secrecy next time. It was something of a relief to have so many people know. He still had a dizzying array of tutors, and Shuga and Gakkai were still at odds. He understood that there were political underpinnings for why they didn't get along, but he longed for a return to his more normal, peaceful days, though he'd like to visit Mitsuha and his brother's grave more often. He was walking down the hall to his room when he caught sight of a bird sitting on a windowsill. It was a Naji bird. Was it the same one he'd saved with Chagum? The Naji birds nodded at him as if it understood something, then flew off. Oh, you see, Chagum approves of the match too. Chagum sighed. With his love life more or less settled for the moment, he set his mind to creating peace between his tutors. First, he'd have to get Gakkai and Shuga to cooperate. Chagum stopped himself. That was literally impossible. The other tutors, sure. In fact, he mused, the conflict really was primarily between Shuga and Gakkai. Except for Rado. Jin clearly hated the Yugaraku family in entirety. There was no way he'd be able to work alongside Rado. But that was probably easily solved by just arranging the tutoring schedule so that Rado and Jin never worked on the same day. So really, all Chagum had to do was get Shuga and Gakkai to schedule the various tutors with people they could get along with. That was easy enough. Are you feeling better, Your Highness? Ventured Shuga. Chagum smiled at him. Yes, thank you. 2 days later, Princess Saruna arrived at the palace. Nimka was among her number, and Tonda switched his Star Reader costume for that of a Songolese servant. There was a huge feast in her honor, and everyone gathered. Chagum sat beside Saruna, chatting happily with her about how she had been since he visited with her, how Prince Tarsan was doing, and so on. Nimka, too, was happy to see him, and she had become the village storyteller since Chagum's visit years earlier. As the party wore late, Shuga approached, and with him was Mitsuha Yugaraku. Chagum gave him a wondering look, as if to ask, "You knew?" Shuga nodded imperceptibly. Amazing! Now he knows again! Amazing! Chagum introduced Mitsuha to Nimka and Saruna, and he and the 3 girls talked and laughed together until well into the night. As Shuga stood to one side, watching, Jin, guarding the dining room with the other hunters, inched closer. So we didn't need to go through all that secrecy after all, huh? Actually, that helped me figure it out, said Shuga. But you know, this is actually better than if it had been the Songolese princess or that Yaku girl. This is something we can work with. Yeah? We'll put in a good word for her with the Mikado and the Holy Sage next time His Highness's betrothal comes up. Jin nodded. I'm glad. Maybe they're not from such different worlds after all. The end.